To fully appreciate the Irish response to the drugs problem and how it has developed to the point it is at today, with its range of services and strong community input, it is important to understand how the drugs crisis evolved from the 1980s onwards and how Citywide emerged as a focal point in representing the community voice in that response.
The very end of the 70s, early 80s was when the drugs problem was really beginning to impact in this area and south inner city as well. When it came to Dublin first, people who were leaders in the community, understandably people just didn't know what they were dealing with.
I would have been a volunteer youth worker back in the 70s and bringing kids on summer projects and things like that. And we would have came across drugs back in the late 70s. I think it was because the Duns were actually importing it around that time. So there was flats on the top of Cashel Road that eventually had to be closed down by Dublin City Council because of the amount of drugs that were being used.
There went from there being, a drink problem and maybe a bit of a hash, but not massive, but drink being big, to a scenario where a lot of young people were using heroin.
Once it did begin to become clear that this was having serious impact on the health of some young people, that it was something that it wasn't just one or two young people that got involved in this. It was beginning to be clear, well now, hang on, there's quite a few young people getting involved. There's one or two who have died. There's one or two who are obviously very unwell. It made sense to people to say, look, the problem is the drug. So the response, I suppose, from community leaders was, well, if the drug is the problem, and if we get rid of it, that'll be the end of the problem.
The guards and the authorities weren't responding to the issue, and communities were badly affected by the drugs and crime at that time.
The general trust of the concerned parents were the group of people and the campaign that was focusing on what the issues were, which was the massive social harm caused by drug dealing and drug taking of heroin in those areas, and the state's inadequate response. They were the issues, and the government, I think, made a fundamental mistake of not trying to co-opt or get in partnership with the majority of people who are involved in the concerned parents. I think that might have been a possibility. That's what happened later on in the 90s.
So it was about the political priorities at the time. The drug problem, they now knew there was a drug problem in the north of the city. It wasn't a political priority. And it was overtaken by other political priorities. And as a result of that, a huge amount of effort went into effectively, I suppose, smashing the concerned parents.
There was a particular ideological approach to drugs as well, which was pretty much, why don't those people stop taking drugs, and when they're ready to be drug free, they can come back and we'll look at treating them then. And that was the kind of state response to drugs. And what was available in terms of drug treatment was, if you were lucky, was a quick 2-week detoxification, and that was it.
There wasn't a needle exchange in Ireland back in the late 70s, so people were actually using the same syringes. And a lot of those people that had shared syringes actually did develop HIV.
You had also the HIV and AIDS, which again was a terrible disaster to happen because people weren't aware of it as they were in later years. And the whole issue of shared needles, people didn't really understand the huge danger they were putting themselves in. So there were many young people, sadly, who may have been only experimenting a few times even with heroin, ended up getting infected, and many of them died, as well as the ones who were using it a lot and so forth. So it was a real human tragedy.
Sometimes people say, well, it came in the 80s and then it went away and came back, and of course it didn't go away at all. I mean, after the mid-1980s, it went out of, I suppose, the public consciousness. It was no longer an issue. It had been a big issue. The very visible dealing in the south inner city ended, the Duns and people like that. There was action against people who were seen as some of the major dealers, and there was this sense, well, maybe that problem's been dealt with.
Obviously, the amount of money being made, and it meant that inevitably it was going to move to other areas. So therefore it moved to Ballymun, Crumlin, lots of other areas.
It was spreading quietly from the north inner city out then. I mean, it was going into, and it was there very early in the sort of nearer suburbs, Crumlins, Ballyfermots, but then spreading further out into the newer suburbs, the Tallaght, Clondalk and Blanchardstown.
Some of the key campaigns in the 80s was to stop the destruction of inner city communities. Now the irony of that is that lots of those people who were shifted out without any social supports, without any real thinking out of what were the consequences of destroying these communities, that they still retain the links with their massive extended families. So once the problem began in the inner city, it wouldn't take long before it spread out.
But all that was kind of, it was like it was seeping out quietly. But bit by bit, I suppose, as it was coming into the early 90s, in particular communities, that was beginning to become a crisis in those areas in the way it had in the inner city.
A community drug problem is when it begins to impact on the networks, the everyday lives, people going about their business. So when it begins to affect people doing their shopping, their bus service, for example, when people stop going out at night time because they're afraid. So it's more about the impact of the drug use rather than drugs themselves or the numbers. And in some communities that impacts more than others.
When people were taken to the streets again, they were focusing, there was meetings in the Old McCushla Hall, they had 800 people at them, and they were about naming drug users, they were about marching on drug users' houses, all of that stuff was going on again. But I suppose at the first meeting when everyone came together, there was a recognition we did that 10 years ago.
I think the community started to get a bit older, that suddenly it was their children that were dying as well, that were dying from overdose or were being infected with HIV and AIDS. And it was slowly dawning on people, look at that, this isn't, there's no quick fix here, this is, an entrenched problem that, requires a bit more thought.
All across the city in different areas, people were saying, we can't manage this anymore. And Icon then, which was here in the North Inner City, they said, let's bring everyone together. Let's just call a meeting and bring everyone together.
First meeting we looked for was the use of Liberty Hall, and again, to get to Liberty Hall you had to go through the trade unions. The trade unions were very receptive because many of their ordinary trade union members in all these areas without Dublin would have raised with the union that this is an issue.
What we tried to do was bring as many people into the process as possible. We called a meeting at Liberty Hall. We created an alliance with the trade union movement, which was very important to us. We also created alliance with the church. We set up the Citywide Drugs Crisis campaign. Now we were still campaigning, doing marches and stuff like that, and local communities were doing wherever they could, but we were trying to get a situation where the seriousness of this problem will at last be recognised.
We said we need to have our very clear policies around what it is we're looking for, and that sort of brought the groups together around not just about protest and street activity, it brought them together around, right, well, what kind of policies do we want?
It was a serious organisation. This wasn't an organisation of people who were just with a political agenda. They had one agenda, and that was the community agenda, and making sure that the community voice was heard in respect of drug treatment.
You also had that some of the drug dealers had become so powerful that they were taken on the state quite openly. And so, for example, Veronica Guerin. But here you had them feeling so powerful that they could take on such a high-profile figure as her and murder her.
This had now become a political priority. It wasn't in the 80s, but it was in the 90s. Main reason being, unfortunately, because Veronica Guerin had been killed. That made it a political priority for the broader society.
You had the murder of Veronica Guerin, and you had more and more emphasis on supply-side measures, on criminal law measures, on the setting up of the Criminal Assets Bureau. And I think that Princess Tarassa and myself are very adamant that we couldn't deal with the problem by criminal law measures alone.
This drugs problem, there's health aspects, we need health services, there's education aspects, we need more, people need to be more aware of what's going on. There's obviously huge policing elements in it. So they said clearly we need an interagency response. You need all these people around the table. No one agency can deal with the drugs issue. So I suppose that was a huge difference to the 80s.
We came to the conclusion that the missing connection was the community. That while you had a situation where the health board claimed to know best, or the Gardaí claimed to know best, the problem was getting worse. So we came up with this pretty unique model that was essentially based on a partnership between the community and the statutory agencies.
Well, the way the task forces were actually set up was a good idea. I think groups that knew what was happening on the ground, they were the ones that were encouraged to put in proposals to the local drugs task force, and they'd send it up to the National Drug Strategy. And it was fairly straightforward at that stage.
Most of us just said we will go in and evolve this as we see it needing to evolve, but based on it said, well, look, we recognise, the most important thing that we can do is get treatments widespread across Tallaght so that you could deliver the drug services on the ground, whether it was in education, prevention, supply reduction, estate management, whatever you needed to do, that the resources would be there for it. It was, as I said, it was almost like a revolution because we were dealing with decision makers.
That was extraordinary for people. Now, this is actually a genuine attempt at engaging communities, and it was at that stage. You know, there was a real commitment to making sure that the community involvement was real. I think it was an acknowledgement in some way by, if you like, the political establishment that we did get this wrong.
In all of the key areas where Citywide had got its representation from throughout Dublin, Tallaght, Ballymun, Dunleary, Rathdown, the poor areas of there, Crumlin, the canal communities, North Inner City, South Inner City, Dinglas, Darndale, all the key areas where there'd been a massive drugs problem, all were now set up with local drugs task forces that had all the local players on. As time went by, everything began to get more bureaucratic. In the early days, you know, the rabbit report is what, a little slapsticky thing, but action happened on it. Later on, you have lovely glossy reports, but far less action.
That the drugs task forces were focused on areas of need, particularly in Dublin, Bray, Cork, and then of course the regional task forces were rolled out in 2000. So as the problem moved outside Dublin, we tried to extend the solutions. And again, Citywide was central to that, supporting the community voice, making sure that the community was central at all stages. As we'd always argue, if the community ain't at the table, there ain't a solution.